Silence has a sound, you know. It's not the absence of noise. It's a presence. It's the deafening roar in your ears when your name is the only one not spoken. It's the collective, held breath of a room full of people witnessing your complete and utter erasure. I was drowning in that silence, and the architect of it all, my grandmother Margaret Mayfair, was the only one who wasn't in the room. Or perhaps she was the only one truly there. My grandmother wasn't a person. She was a weather system. You didn't have a relationship with her. You endured her. You orbited her. From a distance, she was magnificent. A self-made titan who had clawed her way up from post-war poverty to build a logistics empire that spanned continents. She was a legend, a creature of myth. But up close, in the suffocating atmosphere of her presence, she was a quiet storm of judgment, her sharp gray eyes constantly analyzing, measuring, and finding you wanting. Her love, if you could call it that, was a series of impossible tests, riddles wrapped in disdain. I remember when I was 16, I'd won the National Youth Science Exposition. It was the proudest moment of my young life. I brought the engraved crystal award to her study, my hands trembling, my heart aching for a single, simple, "Well done, Clara." She took the heavy award from my hands, turning it over and over. "Glass," she murmured, her voice dry as dust. "Fragile. And what does it do?" I tried to explain the project, something about sustainable energy solutions, but she cut me off. "Theoretical," she said, placing the award on her desk with a dismissive thud. "Your cousin Leo won the regional sailing regatta last weekend. He learned to navigate real winds, real tides. One of these things builds character, Clara. The other just collects dust." She never mentioned the award again. That was Margaret. She didn't raise you. She curated you. And I was a piece she had clearly decided didn't fit the collection. So as I sat in that stuffy lawyer's office, surrounded by the cloying scent of my relatives' expensive perfumes and cheap grief, I braced myself. I expected the equivalent of a dusty trophy, a small conditional trust fund, a minor property, a final puzzle box to solve. I was not, under any circumstances, prepared for the absolute void she had reserved just for me. I watched the lawyer, Mr. Davies, a pale man with a mustache thin as a thread, as he read through the will in a monotonous voice. My Aunt Penelope, who hadn't visited Margaret in 5 years, received a beachfront property in the Caribbean. My Uncle Richard, a man who had tried to sue my grandmother twice, was given a stock portfolio worth a fortune. Even her longtime housekeeper Maria was granted a pension so generous it made my aunt gasp. For a moment, I felt a flicker of warmth. Margaret had a heart, after all. It was just reserved for her staff. Then, Mr. Davies cleared his throat for the finale. "And finally," he announced, his voice taking on a new gravity, "to my grandson, Leo, a man who displays the bold decisiveness and leonine strength necessary to lead in the modern world, I leave my controlling interest in Mayfair Logistics and the entirety of my remaining personal fortune." A wave of satisfaction rippled through the room. I saw Leo close his eyes and bow his head in a perfect performance of humble gratitude. He looked like a king accepting his crown. He was everything Margaret publicly admired: loud, confident, arrogantly decisive. He was a lion, all right. A fat, lazy one who had never hunted a day in his life. He caught my eye and gave me a small, sad smile. It was the most insulting expression I had ever seen. It said, "I'm sorry you're you." The silence that followed was for me. It was my inheritance, the complete and total absence of my name. I felt my skin prickle, the stares of my family physically pressing on me. I focused on the intricate patterns in the Persian rug, counting the threads, anything to keep from screaming, from crying, from simply dissolving into the nothingness she had declared me to be. Just as the room began to breathe again, Mr. Davies, in a move of pure theatrical cruelty that Margaret would have adored, held up a single finger. "Ah," he said, peering at the last page. "There is one final addendum. A minor note regarding personal effects." The room went quiet again, a new curious tension in the air. "Her personal effects currently in her private residence are to be disposed of by the estate, with one exception." He paused, letting the moment hang. "Her old leather suitcase," he read, his voice flat with disinterest, "is to be given to her granddaughter, Clara." A snort of laughter came from my Uncle Richard, quickly disguised as a cough. The humiliation was a physical blow. It was the punchline to a joke I'd been living my whole life. The suitcase. The ancient, battered leather case she'd had since the beginning. The one thing that connected the billionaire to the penniless girl she once was. It was her only piece of sentimentality, and she had turned it into my final shame. Leo gets the empire. Clara gets the baggage. I don't remember leaving the office. I remember the weight of the suitcase in my hand, heavier than it had any right to be. On the drive home, I strapped it into the passenger seat. It felt like I was driving a hearse with a tiny coffin. The city lights smeared across my windshield, blurring with the tears I refused to let fall. Was this it? Was this the final lesson? That I was nothing more than a container for her old, unwanted memories? That night, in the quiet of my small apartment, I laid the suitcase on the floor. It felt like an ancient artifact, a cursed object. For hours, I just stared at it, a war raging inside me. Part of me wanted to take it to a bridge and throw it into the river. Another part, the part that had spent a lifetime trying to solve, the puzzle of Margaret Mayfair, knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Her cruelty was never simple. It was always a doorway. With a surge of angry resolve, I knelt. My fingers trembled as they found the old brass latches. They were cold to the touch. I expected them to be rusted shut, but they sprang open with a well-oiled, satisfying click. She had used this recently. My breath caught in my throat. I lifted the heavy lid, expecting the musty smell of old clothes or forgotten papers. Instead, my eyes fell on a single object, lying pristine on a bed of faded royal blue silk lining. It was a thick, cream-colored manila envelope, sealed with a disc of hard, unforgiving black wax. Typed neatly on the front were 5 words that shot through me like a bolt of lightning, setting my entire world on fire. Last will and testament. Private. If you've ever felt completely erased by someone you loved, do me a favor and hit that. Like button. Let me know I'm not the only one who's ever been a ghost in their own family. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from a terrifying electric shock of hope. This was it. The final riddle. A cruel public spectacle followed by a secret, private vindication. It was the most Margaret Mayfair thing she could have possibly done. I devoured the legal jargon, my eyes flying across the page, past the formal declarations of sound mind and body, searching for the heart of it, the clause that would change everything. And then I saw it. It was printed in the same stark, unforgiving ink as the rest of the document, but the words seemed to lift off the page, twisting the very air I was breathing. I hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments, it declared, and my heart soared. It continued. My entire estate, including all assets, properties, and my controlling interest in Mayfair Logistics, is to be divided equally between my 2 beloved grandchildren. 2? The word hit me like a physical blow. A typo? A cruel turn of phrase? My mind refused to compute as I read the final, impossible words of the clause. My granddaughter, Clara Mayfair, and her twin brother, Nathaniel Mayfair. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed in my silent apartment. I read it again, and the laughter died in my throat. Twin brother, Nathaniel. The name was a phantom, a ghost conjured from ink. It was absurd. I am an only child. My entire life, my identity, was built on that simple, unshakable fact. There was no Nathaniel. There had never been a Nathaniel. I would know. My mother, who had endured 9 months of pregnancy, would certainly know. This wasn't just a secret. It was a biological and historical impossibility. Was this her final, senile, act of madness, or was it a new, more sophisticated form of torture? To grant me my inheritance only to force me to share it with a ghost she had invented. Frantically, I examined the document, searching for any sign of forgery, any flaw in its construction. But it was perfect. Her signature, that familiar, sharp, assertive scrawl, was undeniably hers. The witnesses were names I didn't recognize, and it was notarized by a firm I'd never heard of. As I turned the thick envelope over, searching for more, a small, flat, old-fashioned key fell out, clattering softly onto my wooden floor. A thin paper tag was tied to it with a string. On it, in Margaret's tiny, precise handwriting, were 2 things: the name of an obscure downtown bank and a 7-digit number. It was a breadcrumb, a tangible clue in a sea of absurdity. This wasn't madness. This was a hunt. And I was the hound. The next morning, armed with the will and the key, I walked back into the lion's den, Mr. Davies's office. This time I had requested my parents be there along with Leo. The atmosphere was frosty. Leo looked bored and irritated, as if my very presence was an inconvenience to his new reign. "Mr. Davies," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, as I placed the will on his desk. "I believe this is my grandmother's true final testament." Mr. Davies carefully put on a pair of reading glasses and began to scan the document. The silence stretched on, broken only by Leo's impatient tapping of his pen on the table. Suddenly, the lawyer's head snapped up, his eyes wide with professional shock. He looked at me, then at my parents. "A twin?" he whispered. Leo burst out laughing. It was not a kind sound. "A twin? Are you serious, Clara? This is just sad," he sneered, his face a mask of contemptuous pity. "Couldn't handle being left out, so you typed this up yourself last night? What's next? A long-lost royal lineage?" "It's her signature," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "And it's notarized." "Leo, please," Mr. Davies said, regaining his composure. He was a man of process, of law. "While this is highly irregular, the signature appears genuine on initial inspection. I am legally obligated to investigate the veracity of this document." My mother looked pale, her hand at her throat. "Clara, honey, this is impossible. I would know." Her words, meant to be gentle, were a fresh betrayal. Even she believed I was either lying or losing my mind. The family, my family, was united against me, convinced I was a desperate fraud. The investigation began, and with it, a new kind of hell. Leo hired his own lawyers to shadow my every move, to disprove what they called the phantom will. I was no longer just the family disappointment. I was a scheming usurper, but I had the key. The key was real. My first step was the safe deposit box. I remember walking into the old marble and brass institution, the kind of place Margaret would have appreciated. After a tense hour of verifying my identity and the legitimacy of the key, a grim-faced manager led me down into the vault. The air was cold and still. He retrieved a long, thin metal box, and we inserted our keys in unison. With a heavy thunk, the lock turned. My heart pounded as he slid the box out and placed it on the table in a small, private viewing room. I was half expecting to find stacks of cash, or a confession, or proof. I lifted the lid. Inside there were only 2 items. The first was a single yellowed photograph of 2 infants wrapped in identical blankets. It could have been any 2 babies from any time. There was nothing written on the back. The second was a legal document, establishing a trust fund for one Nathaniel Mayfair. It was dated 30 years ago. I had found him. The relief was so overwhelming I felt dizzy. He was real. But as I read the document further, the hope turned to ash in my mouth. The trust had been established, yes, but it had never been funded. It was an empty vessel, a shell. The photo, the trust, they weren't proof. They were props. Theatrical bait to keep me on the hook. The final dead end came a week later. The bank confirmed the trust account contained a single dollar, its opening deposit. The law firm that had notarized the will was tight-lipped, confirming only their own role as witnesses and refusing to provide any further information. Every clue my grandmother had left was a perfectly constructed mirage, a hallway of doors that opened onto brick walls. I was back at square one, but in a much deeper hole. Now, I didn't just have nothing. I had a forged fantasy, a public failure. The family's mockery was relentless. My parents' worried looks were unbearable. I was lost. The final blow came via a phone call from Mr. Davies. His voice was cold, stripped of all sympathy. "Clara," he said, "Leo and the family have filed a motion to have the second will summarily dismissed on grounds of fraud. A judge has given you a final deadline. You have 48 hours to provide concrete, irrefutable proof of Nathaniel Mayfair's existence. After that, we proceed with the probate of the first will. I'm sorry." But he wasn't sorry. As I hung up the phone, I stared at my own reflection in the dark window of my apartment. A pale, defeated ghost. The clock was ticking. I had failed. I had followed her map right off the edge of the world. There is a unique kind of despair that arrives in the dead of night. It's a quiet, creeping thing that wraps itself around your bones. For 36 hours, I had been living in that despair. The 48-hour deadline was a ticking time bomb, and my time was almost up. I had chased every shadow, followed every false trail, and found nothing. The weight of my failure was absolute, crushing me into my chair as I stared at the blank screen of my laptop. My parents had stopped calling, their silence a testament to their disappointment. Leo had sent me a single text message, a picture of a new ridiculously expensive watch with the caption, "Celebrating early, no hard feelings." I had the email of surrender written in my head. "Mr. Davies, I am unable to provide proof of Nathaniel Mayfair's existence. I hereby concede my claim." Each word was a tiny, bitter pill of defeat. I had not only lost the inheritance, I had lost myself. I had become exactly what they all thought I was, a desperate, delusional fool. My eyes drifted to the corner of the room where the old leather suitcase sat. It seemed to be mocking me, a silent monument to my stupidity. I had fallen for her, trick, hook, line, and sinker. I got up, intending to shove it into a closet, to banish it from my sight forever. But as I grabbed the handle, my fingers brushed against the worn leather, and a thought, sharp and clear, cut through the fog of my despair. This was all too theatrical, too noisy. Margaret's real power was never in grand, obvious gestures. It was in the quiet details, in the hidden clauses of a contract, in the subtle market shift no one else saw coming, the wild goose chase for a secret twin, the theatrical props in the safe deposit box. It was all surface-level misdirection. A magician's trick to make you watch the left hand while the right hand performs the real magic. And I had been watching the left hand all along. My breath caught. What if the hunt for Nathaniel wasn't the test? What if the test was realizing that the hunt itself was a fabrication? Her voice echoed in my head, a memory from a long-ago business lesson she'd insisted on giving me. Amateurs look at the product, Clara. Professionals look at the packaging. The most valuable things are often hidden in the most unassuming containers. I dropped to my knees and turned the suitcase over. My fingers, now with a febrile purpose, traced every seam, every fold of leather. I wasn't looking for a brother anymore. I was looking for my grandmother. I traced the silk lining inside, the same lining I had dismissed just days before. And there it was. A single line of stitching along the bottom edge, almost invisible, was just slightly thicker, slightly more rigid than the rest. It wasn't a flaw, it was a seam. With trembling anticipation, I hooked my fingernail under it and pulled. A section of the lining peeled back with a soft, tearing sound, revealing not the expected wood frame of the suitcase, but a thin, dark sheet of metal. I ran my hand over its cool surface and felt a tiny, almost imperceptible indentation. I pressed it. With a soft, pneumatic click, the false bottom released. It lifted an inch, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. The air that escaped smelled of nothing but old, perfectly preserved paper and Margaret's faint, steely perfume. And inside, nestled in the secret dark, lay 2 documents. The first was yet another will. The second was a thick, multi-page letter, held together with a simple, stark paperclip. On the first page, in her unmistakable script, were 2 words. For Clara. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter. I read, and the voice that filled my head was not a memory, but a living presence, sharp, knowing, and impossibly, terrifyingly alive. My dear Clara, it began. If you are reading this, then you have done it. You have won. You did not just find the will. You understood the game. Bravo. I knew you had it in you. I imagine the last few weeks have been a rather wild goose chase. A secret twin? A ghost in our bloodline? I hope the theatrics were to your liking. I always did have a flair for the dramatic, and one's exit is the most important performance of all. Let me be clear, so no lawyer can muddy the waters. There is no Nathaniel. He was an invention, a phantom, a perfectly crafted illusion designed for one purpose, to serve as my final examination for you. The first will, the one that left you nothing, was simply to clear the board. I needed to see you stand alone, stripped of all allies, and to watch the vultures reveal their true colors. It was cruel, I know, but the world is cruel, and you needed to see that up close. The second will, the twin will, was the exam itself, but the test was not one of perseverance. Any fool can be persistent on a fool's errand. The test was one of perception. I did not need to test your strength, Clara. I always knew you were strong. I needed to test your skepticism. The world is built on convincing lies, presented with authority on official-looking paper. I needed to know if my heir could spot a masterfully crafted lie, even when she desperately wanted to believe it. Leo would have believed the lie because it was presented in a legal format. He respects documents, not truth. He would still be searching for his brother a decade from now. You, I hoped, would eventually respect the truth above the document. You would hit the dead ends and realize that the flaw was not in your search, but in the original premise. And that realization, that beautiful spark of critical thought, would lead you back to the source, back to the packaging, back to me. I had to stop reading. A strangled sob caught in my throat. I thought back to that day with the science award, the shame I had carried for years. And then, her next words washed it all away. I remember you at 16, showing me that crystal award. You thought I was dismissive. You were wrong. I was terrified. Your mind had created something elegant and complex from nothing but theory and intellect. Leo had merely won a race. He sailed where the wind blew. A mind like yours, Clara, a mind that builds, is a target in a world of people who only know how to take. My cruelty to you over the years was never about your worth. It was about teaching you how to build shields. It was a harsh, unforgiving, and perhaps unforgivable way to arm you. It was the only way I knew how. The tears came then, hot and silent. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of absolution. A lifetime of feeling like a failure, of being a disappointment, was lifted in an instant. It was all reframed. It wasn't a punishment. It was preparation. The document you found with this letter is my true and final will. The letter concluded. It is simple and direct. No games. You have passed the test. You have not just inherited my fortune. You have proven you possess the mind needed to protect it and make it grow. You have earned it. You proved you are not a pawn, but a player of the highest order. Now go. Take the board. It's your move, my girl. Make it a good one. And show them all what a Mayfair mind is truly capable of. I slowly folded the letter and picked up the true will. The language was simple. To my granddaughter, Clara Mayfair, who proved she understands the difference between a magician's trick and true magic, I leave everything, wholly and unconditionally. The exhaustion, the despair, it all vanished, burned, away by a white-hot surge of purpose. My desire was no longer about money or validation. It was about executing my grandmother's final, magnificent, brutal work of art. I stood up, walked to my laptop, and with a single satisfying click, deleted the draft of my concession email. Then I picked up my phone. It was time to arrange the final performance. Victory has a certain smell. In that boardroom, it smelled of expensive coffee and self-congratulation. I could see them all as I prepared to walk in, a flock of vultures in couture, gathered to witness my formal surrender. Leo was leaning back, in Margaret's chair at the head of the table, looking every bit the king of a world he hadn't earned. They had no idea they weren't attending a surrender. They were attending a coronation. When I walked through the door, I felt the shift in the room. I had chosen my armor carefully that morning. A simple, severe charcoal-colored dress. My hair pulled back tightly. I wasn't the grieving student they remembered. I let them see the predator my grandmother had cultivated. I walked to the far end of the table and placed my briefcase down with a soft click. Every eye was on me. I let the silence hang, savoring it for a moment before I began my performance. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice even and devoid of emotion. "As you know, the court's deadline expires this afternoon. I have, as requested, concluded my investigation into the existence of Mr. Nathaniel Mayfair." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a meticulously organized file. With the precision of an auditor, I walked them through it. The unfunded trust, the ghost account at the bank, the dead-end law firm, the fruitless search through public records. I presented my failure as a case study in due diligence, my voice never wavering. Leo could barely contain his glee. "So, that's it then," he boomed, leaning forward on his elbows. "A fascinating little story, Clara. A real flight of fancy. We can all appreciate your creativity. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a multi-billion-dollar company to run." His lawyer began to slide a document across the table toward me, my official concession. I didn't even glance at it. "Not just yet, Leo," I said. The change in my tone was electric. The quiet deference was gone, replaced by a steel authority that made everyone in the room sit up straight. "You are correct on one point. The will mentioning a secret twin is indeed a fiction. You just made one critical error." I paused, letting my gaze drift over each of their greedy, expectant faces. "You failed to understand who the author was, and more importantly, why she wrote it." A murmur of confusion went through the room. I started walking, slowly, from my end of the table toward his. I saw the way my calm presence seemed to unnerve him. He shifted in the chair, which suddenly seemed far too big for him. This was never a search for a person, I said, my voice low and carrying. It was a test of character, a final exam, and my grandmother, even in death, has just finished grading your papers. I placed the old, battered leather suitcase on the table with a heavy thud that echoed in the stunned silence. Then, as they all watched, dumbfounded, I popped open the false bottom. I reached inside and pulled out the real will and Margaret's final damning letter. What? What is this? My aunt stammered, her voice thin. This, I said, holding up the thick letter, is the instruction manual for the game you have all been unknowingly playing. My grandmother was a brilliant strategist. She knew your natures, and she wanted to leave her life's work to the one person who was smart enough to see past the board and understand the player. I looked directly at Leo. She knew you would fail, Leo. She wrote, and I quote, Leo would believe the lie because it was presented with authority. He respects documents, not truth. I watched the color drain from his face. I then panned my gaze across my aunts and uncles. She also knew that you would immediately turn on each other and on me, revealing your true natures. Her words, not mine, were, the vultures will flock to what they perceive as the easiest meal. Let them. I could feel the waves of shame and anger coming off them. They couldn't even look at each other. And finally, I said, my voice softening slightly. As I held up the true will, she left this. For the person who saw the truth, who understood that the most valuable things are always hidden. The person who didn't just look at the map, but questioned the existence of the destination. I handed the real will to Mr. Davies. His hands were shaking as he took it. The room was utterly silent. The smugness, the confidence, the arrogance, it had all evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark reality of their humiliation. They hadn't just been disinherited from a second will. They had been intellectually dismantled, their greed and predictability exposed for all to see. They had been outplayed, outsmarted, and utterly conquered. Leo just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. There was no fight left in him. He was a king in a story, and the author had just written him out of existence. The legal fallout in the weeks that followed was swift and absolute. The true will was validated without contest. The empire was mine. Now, as I stand in this office, Margaret's office, my office, the victory feels different than I imagined. I don't feel the kind of giddy triumph Leo felt for his brief shining moment. I don't feel happiness. I feel clarity and the immense, soul-crushing weight of a legacy. My grandmother gave me a gift wrapped in thorns. She taught me that the world is a chessboard, and you must be willing to sacrifice your own pieces to win. She sacrificed my peace of mind, my childhood, my sense of belonging, all to forge me into a queen she thought was worthy of the board. I turned from the window, my own reflection showing a calm, strong face. But I know there's a shadow of melancholy in my eyes. I look at the leather suitcase in the corner of the room. It's not a trophy. It's a reminder. A throne built from a test. It was a brutal, manipulative, and unforgivable act of love. And it was the greatest inheritance she could have ever given me. My grandmother taught me that you don't just inherit an empire. You have to prove you're smart enough to keep it. And for anyone wondering what my first move as CEO will be, subscribe to this channel, because the game is far from over. And for anyone wondering what my first move as CEO will be, subscribe to this channel, because the game is far from over.